𝐒𝐲 agus fáilte a coddh brethebh is Misha Queeveen O'Flanagan. Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to the Brehon Academy, and I'm Kevin Flanagan. And tonight I'm going to be speaking to an author of three books focused around the invasion by the Anglo-Normans. And that man's name is Rua Butler, which is an interesting name considering that the Butlers were one of the most prominent Anglo-Norman families to settle in Ireland. Now, before I jump into that, just a couple of notes. Help me get to 30,000 subscribers, please. If you're not subscribed to this channel, please click subscribe now. Please visit my website as well, which is brehonacademy.org. That's where you're going to find all of the information about my online courses, including Early Irish Culture and Society, Irish Mythology, and the Brehon Laws of Early Ireland. You'll also find a blog over there. We have an online store. And if you want to buy a t-shirt or a poster or something like that, a mug, I would be very grateful. And we have a members library. So if you want to become a member of the website, it's absolutely free, but you need to be a member to access the resources in the members library. And there's quite a few resources in that library. We're also on Facebook, on Instagram, and on X, formerly known as Twitter. And of course, we're on YouTube. And just once again, a reminder to please subscribe to the channel. Hopefully by the end of this video, I will have earned your subscription. And if you want to support me financially, then please consider clicking join under this video and becoming a member for as little as $1.99 per month. Memberships are going to give you access to a lot of perks that non-members don't get, including competitions, exclusive videos, and badges. So, and I'm going to continue to flesh out the membership program as time goes on. With all of that being said, I'm very excited to jump into the interview with Rua Butler. Hello, Rua Butler. I'm very glad to have you on this channel. I have known about your work just for a couple of months, but I was really impressed by your channel, and I decided to reach out to you to see if you would come on to the channel for an interview. And I was also very happy to hear that you were familiar with my channel and my work as well, and that has somehow, inspired the themes of your book. So do you want to maybe introduce yourself first, and how did you, I mean, yeah, you can include it in the answer. Why did you pick the 12th century Ireland as the setting for your Invader series?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for inviting me on. It's a great pleasure to be on the channel with you, because obviously I've been, as I say, it must be 10 years since I first came across a very young looking Kevin Flanagan giving a speech to a large audience. And from there, I can only imagine I've watched 50, 100 of your videos. So I'm delighted to be here. Why the 12th century? Well, I grew up in County Tyrone, up north, and we had maybe 3 or 4 classes I remember in history class when I was like 14, and I was small and redhead and braces and glasses, and I thought, well, there are other guys who are like large playing rugby and whatnot, and I thought, well, I'm not, who am I? What am I in this world? And one day we had a guy came in, Dr. Marsh, and he looked at he was subbing for the usual teacher, and he looked at the class. He ran over and he wrote the Normans on the board, and then the feudal system and a few other things. And then he looked down the class list and he came to my name and he said, "Where is Butler?" And he brought me up to the front of the class and he said, This is one of the most dangerous beings that have ever walked the land of Ireland." And then made me go down and sit back down. And as I was going back to my seat, I was kind of going, me? I'm the dangerous one? I'm the dangerous, untrustworthy? Okay, well, I kind of like that. And I swear from that moment, I was interested in the Normans. I didn't know an awful lot, but I was interested in the Normans. Bored to tears about feudal society and all that sort of stuff, and, field rotations and all that. But I was interested. And the fact that the Normans were kind of considered by this, pretty good historian, he was a history teacher, as a sort of dangerous person. I thought I got to know more. So fast forward 20 years. Oh God, 20 years. And I was over in London, and I was doing a course in journalism, and I was staying with one of my dad's cousins, and she had all this list of the Butler Society journals, and I just went through them one by one, and okay, some of it was about the Tudors and all that sort of stuff, and that's grand, and some of it was about the Georgians, and that's fine, but not one bit of it interested me more than these sort of little snippets that you could get about the 12th century, because it was just a melting pot of various different types of people. You had obviously the Normans, you had the obviously the Gaels and the Vikings, and they were just in this place where, to me, nobody had ever written about them or talked about them or really looked into why the Normans came to Ireland, because they had their reasons for coming across. And I just thought, I got to look into this more. And at the end of it, I went, holy moly, this is a great story. What a story. I mean, like him or loathe him, and I think most people loathe him, Giraldus Cambrensis could tell a story like nobody else. He is some of his...
Can you tell me a bit more about these books that you were reading? What did you say they're the Butler?
Yeah, it sounds very grand. So the Butler family, obviously my surname is Butler, and my cousins are very into genealogy and how we fit into that sort of massive family tree.
Okay.
And so I was looking up at it, and I saw my name at the bottom of this family tree that my cousin had put together, and at the very, very top was a chap called 𝐒𝐰𝐵𝐵 Walter, and he had come across in, I think, 1180s, 1185 with Prince John, and had been granted all these lands, as they did back then. They just pointed at the horizon and said, "Right, 𝐒𝐰𝐵𝐵, everything from here to there is yours. Good luck." And so that was how it all began, really. And what were the books that the Butler Society produce an annual? It's really more of a sort of a little indication of what the Butlers have done and what the descendants of the Butlers. Not everybody who's in it are called Butler, but it's interesting that...
Is this private collection of books, or like?
Interestingly, I think all you need to become a member of the Butler Society is €10, and you can get in. So, as always with our family, it's the cashish that really holds pulls the mustard. So, yeah, it has always been thus. I mean, it's in the name. I mean, even when you look at a map of Ireland and the old clan names and things, you've got all the patronymic ones, and there's 95% of them are patronymic. There's a handful of ones that don't fit in, and Butler is one of those ones that looks so odd to my eye anyway, sitting there, because it's a job title. I mean, the job title, it's us and people like chamberlains and marshals and stuff like that.
And did that, like, at one stage refer to like the function that the butlers performed? Like, were you at one stage, your family at one stage, butlers to the crown?
Exactly that. So as I understand it now, maybe a few years out, but in 1177, Prince John was appointed as Lord of Ireland, I think was the title. There's probably some Latin for that. And his foster father was this chap, 𝐒𝐰𝐵𝐵 Walter. And he had grown up basically following 𝐒𝐰𝐵𝐵 around and learning the ways of being a knight and being an administrator as well in England. And so when he thought, I'm going to be Lord of Ireland, this is Prince John, the bad Prince John from the Robin Hood, and bad Prince John said, I'm an 18-year-old kid. What do I know about running a colony, as it was then? And so he went and looked around, and he saw probably a very stern-looking, I hope very tall, full head of hair, 𝐒𝐰𝐵𝐵 Walter, and said, listen, why don't you become my chief butler? You will be in charge of providing provisions and all the things that a household requires to function when it's presumably on campaign. And so I think 𝐒𝐰𝐵𝐵, he just went, right, I'll need some land to help me in that regard. So he got awarded a bit of Tipperary and a bit of, Kilkenny. And from that, he was expected to basically, I mean, as you probably know, wine was a huge commodity in the 12th century. It was... every noble family would be expected to put on a show and provide the best of the best for their guests. So when the royal household came to Ireland, and thank goodness that from the side of the Butlers thing, they didn't come that often, or we'd have been down a whole heap of cash. But they would have they were expected, the Butlers would have been expected to provide, I would imagine, not just wines but everything else that came from it. When they were made Lord High Chief Butler, or whatever the title was, they were also given this right to a cut of every single cargo of wine that landed in Ireland, which, I mean, I think we need to look into that and see if we can get that going again, because that would be pretty nice little learner. So he was able to exact, and I would imagine it was pretty difficult to exact that tax, or let's not use the bad word tariff right now, but that tax on incoming bulks of or cargoes of wine. And but I'd imagine if a cargo of wine landed in Fitzgerald territory, the Butlers are going to be hard pushed to force them to pay up on the wine tax. So who knows how much money they made out of it. But it's interesting that the name Walter, which was the surname or pseudo surname that the family had when they arrived in Ireland, disappeared, and it was replaced with this one of Butler, which, you know, as I understand it, like in French it would have been de Butler. In Irish it's more akin to what we now use. Yeah. And in England there was a slight, you know, there's O's at various and E's in various different places for the Butlers in England. So as I understand it, the name Butler is taken directly from the Irish translation of the title. So in a funny sort of way, it is a very Irish name, and in other ways it's yeah, you know, Frankish or something.
You just reminded me that I had a teacher when I was in school called Miss de Butler, and it was kind of spelt with the IER at the end.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm pronouncing it Miss de Butler. And I think that she kind of retained this idea of the French sounding surname. And yeah, I just thought that was pretty interesting.
It's an odd one. I mean, I've you know, I have friends who are from out west, you know, Mayo and places like that, and they have resumed the Irish spelling of the name, and you know, it's so similar. You can't be mistaken for anything else, really. So it's yeah, I'm all for that sort of thing. My cousin is she's Prendergast, and she's from Malta, and she lives out in Galway. And she was wondering, she was asking me about, you know, why some names are, you know, D and some names are L, you know, LE, and I had to say to her, I have no idea what what's going on there, but it was, you know, I presume it's from the derivation and where they've come from in the past. So yeah. It's very interesting.
Okay, so let's unpack some of the books that you wrote, because I think you've only written 3 books, is that right?
Yeah, only written 3 books.
But I don't mean only, but because that's accomplishment.
They're tough, Kevin. They are tough to do. I mean, I would have anybody take a swing at them, but it is an undertaking. But yeah, I've actually written more, but the 3 that have been published are about the Normans coming to Ireland. The ones that haven't been published were not good. Were not good at all. So, but they were all practice towards getting a few books out and into the world.
So the first book you released, I think it was in 2015, and that was Swordland.
Wow.
The second book you released was called Lord of the Sea Castle in 2017. Is that right?
That's one, yeah.
And the third book you released, you got published, is the Earl Strongbow, and that was in 2018. Right. So could you maybe just talk us through some of the plots and some of the main characters, and just give us an idea of what you're actually talking about in those 3 books?
I will. Well, when I started out trying to write the book, my first attempt at writing about 12th century Ireland was, I was going to write a book about Dermot McMurrough, and it was from his perspective. And that was difficult, trying to make a person who has a little bit of a reputation, and trying to make him into a kind of person that you didn't, you know, I think how he is in the books that they are now, and he does appear, you respect him, but I don't think you like him. And I think that's as good as it's going to get for poor old Dermot. His legacy is that's as good as I can possibly make it. But when I realized it wasn't quite working with Dermot as the main character, I'd read Nicholas Furlong's book by that stage, which is Dermot, King of Leinster, which really impressed me. And I think it was out in the 70s, maybe the 80s, but I'd read it and I was really impressed with it, and that's why I went from that angle. But thereafter, I just realized that we had, again, the Normans in Ireland, it's always going to be a kind of an issues there. There's always going to be people who are going, oh, what are you doing? You can't make heroes. And I don't think I've made heroes out of them, but it begins, I'll go back to the plot. I think it's easier for people who aren't from this island to come on board with people that they kind of feel familiar with. People call Robert rather than Murchita or something like that. I think even those little things help bring them into the story. And that, above all else, was what I was hoping to do. Give a good appraisal of what it was like in the 12th century in Ireland, and sort of give an idea of what we were about in this country, as far as people coming in and how it all went about. But the first book is called Swordland. It is starts in 1165, and it's this down on his luck knight called Robert FitzStephen, real life person who was a half brother of the Fitzgerald. Obviously Fitzgerald's, but FitzStephen is a name that's disappeared. But FitzStephen is known as the first invader of Ireland. He's the one that broke the bonds of Ireland, I think the phrase is. And that to me was a good place to start, because it's at the, although there were people coming over before that, he was the person that sort of had the most impact very early on. And he turns up in Ireland after, having a pretty weird career in Wales. And, the Wales story in itself under the Normans is a story that should be told as well. It's so thoroughly interesting. Similar to Ireland, but it's definitely its own thing. And Robert was a kind of a knight out on the western extremes of Wales, who was given an offer of winning some lands in Ireland after a rather big disaster of his own in Wales when he lost, when he was captured by the Welsh prince Rhys of Deheubarth. And then he comes to Ireland with a pretty tiny army of about 400, of which I think only 60 were what we would sort of today know to be knights. And I'm going to stop doing this because I've done it like 15 times. But we would sort of recognize as knights. They aren't in plate armor, but in chainmail, and probably looked very similar to what we saw on the Bayeux tapestry from 3 generations before, when William the Conqueror came to England. And that's the sort of people that are coming into Ireland at this time in the 1160s and 1170s. They're chainmail. They've got the spangle helm with that very distinctive nose covering. They are they don't have big lances. They have what we would recognize as spears as their primary weapon. They've probably got those lovely teardrop. I think those lovely teardrop shields just put you exactly into Norman state of mind when you see and hear them. They're riding what I would expect to be ponies or large ponies rather than small horses, not these destriers that we see later. They are guys who have been forgotten by their own king. They've been left on their own in Wales. They are on the back foot in Wales because obviously Wales have a history of bowmen, and they're starting to learn the ways that of fighting the Normans, having had the Normans on their doorstep for a good 50 to 80 years. And these are the people that are coming across. And at the start they're called the Grey Foreigners. That's a name that's attributed to them, and that's presumably because of this chainmail that they're seen at riding the countryside. So yeah, Robert FitzStephen, he is he's a good character because he loses as much as he wins, and it's his story continues on to the 1180s in Munster. He takes part in the Munster invasion as well. So he may come up in the future if I get around to writing a few more books, because I've been reading recently about the invasion of Munster. Class, absolutely class. So interesting. And you've got the McCarthys coming into it, and Donald Moore O'Brien, who's one of my all-time heroes. He's a ledge, and just needs to be told, put into book form because he's class.
And how much are you researching the actual real life people? Is it like, how accurate is the historical fiction that you're writing?
Yeah, That's it. Well, there's always a balance, I feel, because I don't want to go too far away from where these people find themselves at any given time. So I sort of picture it like a stepping stones, in that the stepping stones through the river, I know where I need to be in about 40 pages time, but how I get there is up to me. And how they, what they say and what they do, and who they want to shag or kill is up to me. And
Yeah.
I think that's the interesting part, because I can give a bit of, by knowing where the history is taking me. And generally at the start I do all the research and then just kind of put the books aside, and unless there's something I've forgotten, I won't even look at the books again, because at that point you're kind of interested in character, and you want to give. I mean, it doesn't have to be. To me, it doesn't have to be a massive. So I kind of I put placeholder characters. I have a list of the placeholder characters. So, for instance, Maurice Fitzgerald, the guy who has given his name to this huge family, I was pretty sure he was going to be in Swordland and maybe in one of the other or two of the other books, but I knew he wasn't going to be a major character. So I just had Maurice Fitzgerald hyphen quiet, and that was the only. I just put that aside. So I said he's going to be quiet, and I think even at the start I said Aoife, the daughter of Dermot McMurrough, ambitious or something, and you can move from there. You can go in any direction from there. So it's, as far as the research goes, I try to do it as much as possible at the start, and then just put it aside, because then all that sort of stuff, and you're out walking the dogs or whatever, and it's a mix. It gets mixed up in there, and it becomes a bit more interesting.
And how interconnected are the three books? Like, I mean, does the storyline continue in each book, or is it completely different characters?
Well, the lead character in Swordland is Robert FitzStephen, and then his story and history, it kind of sort of stops for quite a bit. It kicks off a little bit later, but the more interesting character when he sort of disappears from history is Raymond de Carew, Raymond le Gros, who is another Fitzgerald. That word is going to come up quite a bit in this story, I'm afraid. But Raymond de Gros takes over. But the last scene of the first book is kind of the first scene of the second book. So you kind of see Raymond le Gros' ship arriving in Baginbun at the end of the first book. So it's that sort of thing. I'm always trying to sort of at least set up the next book, because
Okay.
I was kind of trying to trick the publishers into asking me to write another one. So it's
All right, and so on to the third book then, the Earl of Strongbow.
yeah.
Does Raymond de Carew or Robert FitzStephen make a reappearance in the Earl of Strongbow? Sorry, the Earl Strongbow. Or what's happening in that book?
Well, and here I'm letting you behind the scenes here, but I actually came up with that title way in advance before I knew what it was going to be. So they were asking me what the title was going to be, and I kind of went, oh, panic, 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 and threw that out. So the lead character in the Earl Strongbow is again Raymond de Carew, but his antagonist, friend, ally, political, it's a bit political, but Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare he is a major character in it, and he is not strong and he doesn't have a bow, but I just felt the name Strongbow is too synonymous with the Norman invasion to do away with it. So I know he wasn't called Strongbow when he was alive. He probably, his grandson never heard that word, but it's just too powerful a name, I think, and too interesting to give, to have a chap who, as I say, wasn't a warrior. History doesn't say he was a warrior. History says that he was a person who would give a speech and then sort of stand back a bit. He wasn't the idea that we see in later times of this hulking hero with a big red beard, and he was a politician, and not a particularly good one.
Interesting. And so where did he get the name Strongbow?
Well, from what I hear, he was the Earl of Striguil. Striguil is the area around Chepstow in Gwent, what's now Monmouthshire. And it seems that at some point when people were looking at because obviously the French would be arc-four, bow, strongbow, but or something similar. But strongbow seems to have been something that they've put together through very little detail. Maybe a mistranslation of the name Striguil, or maybe they saw the seal of his father, Gilbert de Clare, because he's pictured with this really long, dramatic hair and a bow. And maybe they saw that and they thought, well, there we are. He's a Strongbow. That's a cool name. And yeah, I'm glad they did, because it's a really effective word that's, it comes
Yeah.
down the history to us today, and it speaks to us in a very weird way. I don't like their cider very much, but it's distinctive, and
Yeah.
if you put that against William the Conqueror, I think Strongbow wins every time. That's cool.
So you have kind of, I would say, quite interesting characters in Robert FitzSimon and Raymond de Carew, and I would say that they're pretty central to your stories. How do you develop those characters? Is there any particular like method that you have to develop these characters?
Yeah, I mean, well, yes. I mean, the way I always looked at it is that obviously the history feeds into what they do, because, for instance, we know that after the Battle of Baginbun, the Normans slaughtered about 70 noblemen of Waterford, Viking Waterford. And how you balance that out, as I went and looked at what our friend Geraldus Cambrensis said in his, and he completely blames Hervey de Montmorency. And then I went and looked at the Song of Dermot and the Earl, and they say, oh, it was this person, Alice of Abergavenny, who got, we don't know where she's from, we don't know anything about her. And I just thought, that's political, that is entirely political. The timing of these two tellings of the same events. At the start, the Fitzgeralds were rivals when Geraldus Cambrensis was writing. The Fitzgeralds were kind of rivals of the Strongbow's family, and then later they had married into that family, and were now the Prendergasts, who I think were the ones behind the writing of the Song of Dermot and the Earl, were now involved with the Strongbow's family. So they had to blame somebody else, and they couldn't blame Harvey de Montmorency. They couldn't blame, who was a Strongbow's uncle. They couldn't blame Raymond de Carew, who had also married into Strongbow's family. So they were kind of scratching their heads, and then I think what they did was simply make up a human being called Alice of Abergavenny, give her a class story, and then run with that. And I think, so for instance, that I'm saying about character here, but Raymond de Carew, how do I balance out him being the hero of these stories, as well as him having, in my opinion, conducted a massacre of nearly 100 people at Baginbun in the most horrific way. So you have to try and take those two elements and try and balance them out. And they feed off each other, and it makes it interesting, because all I had was, at the start, I had Raymond de Carew - romantic. And that was all I started with when I started writing the book. I think he's a romantic character, and I don't mean that in always a positive way. I think romantic characters are often stupid, in fact, very often stupid, and they often act without reason and without thinking, and so that feeds into it, and you just kick off from there. And I would rarely tell anybody to come up with an entire character. And a person's story is one thing, person's story plan as much as you like, but a character, I think, has to develop as you write, because you can find yourselves in very difficult positions, and then having to write around it is part of the joy of it, really.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of other examples, but Dermot McMurrough, as I said, he was. I still don't really understand him. I think
Yeah.
ambition just got the best of him, but on so many occasions, he shows
He's a
himself to be.
complicated character, even for Irish people, to reconcile, because like you're kind of like, what was his ambition? And I know that he wanted to get his kingdom back, and his wife had basically been like kidnapped by the O'Connor family, but then there's questions about how much was like his wife instigating that kidnap, and he went to the King Henry, I think King Henry II, and asked for permission to send knights, and I believe King Henry didn't actually come himself until much later,
Yeah,
when Strongbow Strigul started to, have a lot of the Pale under his control. And then King Henry rolled up with a massive army, and Irish people had never seen an army so big before. And they all kind of gave fealty to him, like they all kind of bent the knee, let's say that, because they had never been confronted with such a massive army before. So this comes back to Dermot McMurrough, who you could kind of say he's the bastard of Irish history. But at the same time, he was only retaliating against his like mistreatment from the other royal families. I believe it was like I want to say O'Rourke clan from the King.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
was. And O'Connor's, and they kind of got together and they allied up, and then they went and took this guy's kingdom. So he's like, "What else am I going to do? I'm going to
yeah.
appeal for assistance from King Henry II, who was, as we know, a lot more powerful than these Irish clans. So he's definitely a complicated character.
I don't like getting beaten in rugby by Connacht. Never mind being, having the kingdom hoik from underneath me. Like, I mean, this is. I mean, I would love to think that I'm a 21st century kind of guy, and I'd, peace, love, and harmony. But I don't know. If push came to shove, I don't know. It's a very difficult one. The he himself is obviously will go down in history and will continue to as the great traitor of Irish history. But he's complicated. I would urge people to go and have a read about him and not just go with the usual few words around him, because there's a lot more to the man. Even looking to the fact that he became king when he was a kid. He was like 16, and he became king of one of the most powerful kingdoms certainly in Leinster, but in Ireland. And he had to grow up so fast, and he had to be, I'm sure, as vicious as everybody else around him. And somehow this really talented kid turned into a monster. And sure, we've seen that in Star Wars. We've seen that in every other. That's a great story in itself.
Yeah.
Um, but the fall from grace has been fairly mighty, to say the least.
But actually, like that clan became Murphy clan, and like the McMurrough became Murphys, and also Myrna, and the descendants of McMurrough redeemed that family name, I would say. They didn't take the McMurrough name, okay, fair enough. But they did great deeds during the like later um, you know, acts of rebellion, let's say.
Yeah.
um, where I can't recall the story, but I do recall reading a story and going like, oh, that's the descendant of McMurrough, and he's redeemed himself.
Well, that's it. Like my family, the Butlers, my Butler family are from Carlow, and obviously that was Kavanagh territory. On both sides of the Black Stairs into Wexford and Carlow. So like Art McMurrough Kavanagh was, I don't know, 12. Hello,
Yeah, you're back.
I'm back. Apologies. I thought it was I'd gone forever there. What was I saying about the Art McMurrough Kavanagh?
You're
Yeah,
saying
great,
so, yeah,
great
Art
hero.
McMurrough. Yeah,
And he was a great hero, and he sort of faced off against Richard II, who came across in all his pomp and majesty and all that in the 1390s, and he saw him off easily, really. So yeah, as you say, that the Kavanagh name it should be lauded, and I would just, as I say, urge people to learn a wee bit more about their progenitor Dermot McMurrough Kavanagh, or Dermot McMurrough, because he's
yeah.
he's an interesting sod.
You've mentioned elsewhere that you had this desire to immerse readers in the unfamiliar world of the 12th century Ireland. And that, I think, even extended to keeping non-anglicized names to evoke the Norman experience. How do you ensure that this immersion feels authentic and relatable?
With very great difficulty. But what my I agree that is really important, because we're over here. We weren't the same as England. We weren't really the same as Wales or Scotland or anywhere else. We had our own thing going on over here, and I think that had to be reflected in the books. And to be honest, the first Normans who came across to here were, they were frontiersmen, really, in Wales, and now they're beyond the frontier. They're in a very alien, dangerous place. And I think that the books have to reflect what they find here and try to do it as accurately as possible. And to do that, you're trying to not fall into the old tropes of, spears and axes and stuff, because I don't want to have my name in the same sentence as 𝐒𝐻 𝐂𝐚. I don't need that in my life. So you're trying to give it as accurately as possible, and you're trying to do it in a way that you're not trying to make them into some sort, the ancient Irish, the Irish of the 12th century, into something that there weren't. And when they were, as you've sort of said, when they were presented with Henry II's army, they were scared, and because they'd never seen anything like this. And that's one of the things I always think about Dermot McMurrough. He was not sure. He thought he had it all worked out. He thought he knew what he was doing when he brought this relatively small number of people to Ireland, but he just didn't comprehend. He didn't understand them, and I think that's entirely understandable, because I don't think we today completely understand the people who came across to Ireland, even to this, because we're always trying to nail them down, and they are the least. I'm going to use some terrible language today, but they are the least nailable, downable people that there ever have been. They change, and as soon as you think you've got them, they'll change again. So
that's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
They call them English, they'll probably go, oh yeah, and then they'll change. And call them Normans, they go, oh yeah, and they'll change. Call them Cambro Normans, they'll go, maybe. They'll. I just don't think we can nail them down. On the Irish part of it, it's interesting, because obviously technologically not advanced, but culturally, what the Normans found was a culture more ancient, more noble, more fair-minded than what they had come from.
Yeah.
And they looked at it and went, holy moly, that I like. And it was irresistible. That, militarily they had the better of the Irish. There's no two ways about it. But culturally they were overwhelmed. And that's why we see what we see happen over the next couple of centuries.
Yeah. You mentioned an author there, and I know why you said I didn't want my name to be in the same sentence as 𝐒𝐻 𝐂𝐚. But for those who don't know who he is, maybe you could explain why you feel that way. I know why you said it, but just for others.
Well, Gerald was he was. I mean, I don't know who. Most people will recognize the name, the Daily Mail. I don't say it often out loud or reference it in any way, but I'm going to here, because they will take a headline and whack it on. And if you open the story and read below it, you will see that the headline is nothing to words. That's the sort of person he would have loved. He would have loved the news, the way the news works today. 𝐒𝐻 𝐂𝐚. He was obviously a monk from the south of Wales, a place called Manorbier on the Gower Peninsula. His elder brothers were two of the people who appear in the books, or sorry, one who has appeared and one who would have appeared if I ever get to Munster. Robert de Barry and Philip de Barry. And as you know, we've got Barrys all over the place in Ireland. And 𝐒𝐻 𝐂𝐚 is one of their number. But he would have loved clickbait. He would have been on top all over that. He would have clickbaited to the end of the earth. Daily Mail wouldn't have had a chance. But he came across, he obviously was closely affiliated with the Normans. He listened to them, these people who'd been fighting on and off for nearly 20 years by the time he came to Ireland. And he listened to the stories, he listened to the things and all that, I would imagine over a few beers, and he was saying, then he wrote them down and he took it off and he just sort of added his own bits to it, as in fairness, historians of that era will want to do anyway. And he added his own stories and he added things that were hearsay, and it's not a good look to say such terrible things about people as he did. And I'm loath to say it, he is an exceptionally good writer, because it's his historical fiction. Yeah, well, it's historical fiction as much as I am. I mean, that's what he's doing, in my opinion, because there are stories that he puts in there that are they're just mean spirited. And I would imagine, he was of a Welsh Norman background. His parentage was as much Welsh as it was Norman, and he didn't see kinship in that. He saw jealousy, and I get the idea that he was the sort of you know, oh, I'll rush through the door and then I'll slam the door behind me and nobody else who's just like me can get in behind me. And I think he's of that mindset where he doesn't want anybody to have the same advantages, even if they're from the same background. He wants
Interesting.
to, he slams the door behind him and he says, nobody else is getting through and taking this away from me.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's a very modern problem that we have today as well, you know, and you can put it to any
Yeah.
subject that probably not worth bringing up here, but there are people in like that in our own lives who, you know, who rather than trying to throw an arm around somebody, would rather knock them
Push.
off the boat, you know. Oh, maybe that's a weird choice.
Yeah, I was actually interviewed the other day by Philip Ojeda of Irish medieval history, and we were happening to talk about Geraldus Cambrensis because he asked me about the symbol of the white mare. And this is a famous story where he was writing about the people of 𝐒𝐿, which is modern Donegal. Um, and he was saying that, like, oh, in Donegal, the chieftain does this ritual where he publicly mates with the horse and then he slaughters the horse and then he produces a broth. But the thing is, right, like, there's no contemporary sources saying that same thing. So I imagine it was like some clan in Connacht who wanted to, complain about the clans from Donegal, 𝐒𝐿 at the time. And they were just filling him full of
Guff.
stories.
Yeah.
Filling him full of guff, exactly. And now I should mention that there is evidence of this happening in the village, in Indo-European culture. Yeah, there's definitely evidence of this happening. So he may have just he may have been aware of like a folk memory or something like that. But in Ireland, there's no manuscript aside from his manuscript that says about this white mare, and it's a public display of affection. Let's just say
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
It's a sort of thing that, you know, I can only imagine that Chinese whispers, and from one end of all, you know, Ireland, where nobody from the Norman, I mean, even in his own writing, he writes about a wrath somewhere in, like, I think Laois, and he talks about one group of Normans who hide out on a raft and they see a ghost army. And he writes this into his book that
Yeah.
there's a ghost
Yeah.
army. Now, I took that to mean it was a bad day of mist around, you know, 𝐿𝐼𝐴 or something. But, you know, he's also writing about ghost armies, and he's writing about this, and people are taking them seriously. And, you know, even the medieval mind, we're going, right, come on here, this guy's,
Yeah.
yeah. So maybe we as modern people are taking him a wee bit too seriously, but, you know, he has a turn of phrase. At the same time, he's a turn of phrase which is exceptional. That, like, if you can find a translation of his work, it is worth reading just for the turn of phrase, because he is wonderful. He brings the stories that would otherwise have disappeared. It's a useful source for this period, but I wouldn't rely on it. That's for sure. And to be honest, his name has gone down badly, Gerald of Wales, in this part of the world, because of the things like we've just described, and his and I think you feel the meanness of his spirit. You feel the meanness in him, and I don't think he's going to be righted. And no matter what I do, I didn't want to have that on my conscience, because so what I've written, I hope is always going to be considered accurate. Is maybe too strong, but certainly in keeping with what was how it may have been, and
Yeah, well,
that's important.
your books have been praised for their impeccable historical research. So, yeah, I don't think you have anything to worry about there. But I'd like to go back to something you were saying previously about this idea of the Anglo-Normans arriving in Ireland and being confronted with this ancient culture.
Mm,
And I know that you use your books as a way to explore themes like Brehon Law.
yeah.
So how do you use your books to do that? I mean, can you
Mm.
describe how you talk about Brehon Law? Is there any specific features that come up in the book? And how do you weave the principles of Brehon Law into your storytelling?
I can do that. I can't really remember an instant in the books, but I wrote a sort of spec script. I work in TV production now, and I wrote a spec script about the Spanish Armada, and obviously that ended up kind of in coming across the west of Ireland and having a very bad time. And in that, I wanted to give an impression of how the later Brehon Law, because it was still existing in the 16th century and particularly over in the West. And I wanted to give the impression about how even kings, the whole of society was held to account by Brehon Law. And it wasn't by forcing people to do it. It was just an accepted practice that this is how things are done. This is the way that it works. This is, when people for instance, I mean, 𝐒𝐿 𝐂𝐚 in the 12th century, when he lost the high kingship of Ireland, he wasn't taken down by another, king of Connaught or king of Munster. He was taken down by a minor chieftain from, I think over, in County Down, one of the 𝐒𝐿𝐂𝐵𝐵𝐵s. And he was taken down by that. He had been abandoned by all his troops. He'd been abandoned by everything. This was the High King of Ireland, the most powerful man on the island, and he was taken down by that because he had contravened, something that was considered within the laws as not cool, dude. And he was taken down and taken out by it. And that instant of him contravening by blinding, I think, one of the 𝐒𝐿𝐂𝐵𝐵𝐵s, led to his complete, all his troops dispersing. The people that he had alliances and webs, as far as Wexford.
Yeah.
This is a man probably from Dungannon, and he had a web of alliances, and they all fell apart overnight because of his contravention of the Brehon laws. So the idea that their people are being held together by this cultural, cocoon that sort of everybody's held by it all is just it's so interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I genuinely feel it as modern.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. What I wanted to say is, when you were speaking there, it reminded me of a concept that comes up in Brehon Law quite a bit, which is called fear flahaman, and that's the judgment of the noble judgment. It was considered like the remit of the king to be noble, to have noble judgment in their words and in their deeds. And also it comes up in the mythology about 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐝, which are sacred taboos that could be placed on kings and warriors and so on. And these sacred taboos, you kind of go, well, why would they follow that? But time and time again, where they deviate from these sacred taboos, doom and misery follows them. So it's very interesting to think about this story that you told me just now about 𝐒𝐿𝐴 𝐂𝐚 or 𝐒𝐿𝐴. Yeah, because that just highlights once again this idea, the importance of the king's truth. And also the king at the time, like the king was expected to be, we would say today, the judgment of King Solomon. But at the time, they would say the judgment of a Brehon. And kings would be called upon quite regularly to judge, to hear the cases and to judge. And they were expected to have, good judgment. And that reminds me of the story of Cormac MacArt, whose father's throne had been usurped, and it was on the hill of Tara. And long story boring, to make a long story boring, there was a case about a sheep that had escaped and got into the queen's crops and ate the queen's crops. Now the queen called on her husband to be the judge over that case. So the queen called on the king to be the judge over that case, and he said that the sheep should be given as compensation. And the young boy Cormac MacArt, hearing this in the crowd, said, no, that's the false judgment. As the fleece grows on the sheep, so does the fleece regrow on the land. So you should give the wool as payment. And that was considered the true judgment, And it's very interesting when you see time and time again this concept of true judgment. We even have the collar of Moran, which used to tighten if he said a false judgment, or falsehoods were being spoken in the area. So I think that's very interesting.
Well, I mean, I try to, when people ask me about it, and every so often people ask me about it, and I try to come up with a kind of shortcut to what it was about, and it feels very fair dinkum. There's a fair dinkum to a lot of this. A fairness of judgment and a sensible idea where you go, nailed it, well done, and that kind of, the judgments are, when they're right, you sort of feel that they're right in your bones.
Exactly.
And it feels fair. So I can't remember the video, but I have watched one of your videos where you were talking about something. Would it be applicable in modern day? Um, it must have been from about 10 years ago, Kevin. So I paraphrase, but it was something online. Would it be applicable nowadays to have something similar in modern society? And that's a really interesting concept that it has been bubbling away for quite some time about how it might be done. And obviously, the outcome would have to be that idea of, that's a fair outcome, that's a fair judgment. And I just think at the moment, there's so often we see, things coming from court system that just don't feel fair.
Exactly.
And it just doesn't feel like it's, and I know we have to come up with these things in advance of the judgment. We can't just, the judges are limited by what they can say and obviously hand down. But so often we just see people going, well, that's not bloody fair. That person,
Yeah.
how is that being awarded to that person? And anyway, it's the Brehon Law is, to me, and I think from the Norman perspective, when they arrived in Ireland and they were coming from a place which, like I was talking about Theobald Walter earlier on. His younger brother was Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was one of the, if not the prime mover and shaker in codifying common law. He was right up there with Ranulph de Glanville and Henry II, coming up with these, and Osbert Fitzharvey, coming up with these, codifying the idea of common law, which now obviously is across the Western world and is what we base our law on. But I think even his younger brother came, or his brother Theobald Walter came to Ireland and looked at what was happening in Ireland and went, well, there's another way here. There's a different way. And that's why hundreds of years later, his descendant, Black Tom Butler, Earl of Ormond, had Brehons living and working for him, because there was a sense of, this is the fair way to do it, and this is how we can do it. And okay, it's a sort of unregulated kind of thing, but it's still regulated. But it's a hugely interesting subject, and there's no way that you could have come up with a better name for the channel than Brehon Academy, because you'll be trying to teach it for the rest of your days, because it's so interesting.
I have a law degree, and when I was studying law, I realized that like not a lot of people know about these topics. And the mission, one of the missions of the Brehon Academy is to make it, give it popular awareness and to fill in those gaps in
Yeah,
knowledge. And just as you were speaking there, you reminded me of this very interesting juxtaposition that I picked up when I was reading about Sir John Davies, who was writing in the very early 17th century, just after the flight of the Earls and the Battle of 𝐿. And he said something like, there is no nation of people under the sun who love equal and indifferent justice better than the Irish, nor will they rest better satisfied with the execution of the law, even if it's against themselves, so that they too can have the benefit and the protection of the law when upon just cause they do desire it. So that's a very interesting insight into a man, the words of a man who was actually instrumental in abolishing the Brehon Law. And then you fast forward to, I think it was 1950s, 1960s, 20th century anyway. And you have a barrister writing now in the Bench and Bar in Ireland. R.W. Bentham was his name. And he says something like, Irish irreverence for law does not stem from sympathy with crime or wrongdoing in general, but rather from the fact that the Irish, who have a fairly long memory, know that the law in Ireland today is not Irish law, however just it may be. It doesn't command reverence as a native institution, but merely respect nowadays as a part of the machinery of government. So you have these people that were described in the 17th century as being like, no nation of people under the sun love equal and indifferent justice better than the Irish. To you fast forward a couple of hundred years, and now they're irreverent of the law. And the barrister was right in acknowledging or recognizing that that's because it's not Irish. It's not from our heart. It's not us. And that's why we have this attitude today is like, you don't want to get on the wrong side of the law.
And I can imagine the history of that is personal as well, because obviously what we were looking at during the penal years and everything was not fair. It was not what we have just been talking about. Those those ideas weren't present in the law of the day, which is very sad, because one of my grandfather's grandfather was a judge, in the 19th century, and I've never gone looking and seeing what his judgments looked like, or how he was considered, but when you do any sort of reading, it doesn't even have to be particularly deep. You see the injustice there, and you can completely comprehend why somebody would say what you've just outlined, why there would be a feeling of frustration, to say the least, at what they were meeting in the law courts. It's a hugely interesting subject. I mean, I think it's fascinating, and as I say, I did a little bit to sort of give a flavor in it on this Spanish Armada script that I wrote, and it was basically one of the Spaniards who had come from a situation where it was the king told his next man down what to do, and the Duke Count told the next man down, and suddenly a captain of a ship was sailing towards England, going, "Oh my God, we don't know what we're doing. How are we going to lift an army in the Netherlands and take them to England? Has anybody given any consideration?" So he was coming into an Ireland, from that perspective, and coming into a land where, I think that Derb Fina is the phrase for the sort of collection of great men of the tribe who would have a conversation and, discuss issues like that with the king or the top man. And it must have been a very, very strange thing for a Spaniard to see in the 16th century, as it was for a Norman to see in the 12th century, coming across and seeing, they couldn't have but interacted with Dermot McMurrough's Derb Fina, these chief men. And I can't imagine they were, Strongbow was going across and going, no, everybody come in, we'll have a little discussion about how the battle's going to go. When one man is making the decision at the very top and everybody else has their grumbles, it's a very different situation. Whereas Dermot McMurrough was coming in and having a discussion and coming up with a plan with, say, the 10 or 15 greatest men in his tribe or his clan or whatever you want to do. It's a very different way of looking at things, and it can't have been anything other than just odd for those first Normans who would have, they may have even have interaction with Henry II, who would have just sort of pointed and saying, "Get rid of him, promote him, let's get on to the next town," and make some judgments. As I say, what I try to do is give that sort of the impression in the books where it's a complicated system that was in Ireland at the time. The Normans were kind of coming in going, "Are we the enemies of the Irish? No, we're not really. We're fighting the Vikings in the towns, because that's what we're after. We're after the towns. So we're alongside the Irish, but we're invaders here. But I don't really understand what they're getting at with all this kind of the way that they're laying out the system. Why are they not riding horses? Where are their archers? What is going on?" And it's a lot feeding in, but they came here, I think, with open eyes, maybe not open arms, but they came here with open eyes, and that they were going to somewhere that was very different from where they'd been. And it's just such an I mean, I'm so shocked when the publisher said, "Yeah, we want to print this," because it's so different to other things that are written out there. Obviously the names are difficult for people who haven't been on this island for 30 years. The place names, they get confused, and why is it not, why is it the ossuary, or why is it the 𝐒𝐚? It's not just, that's a place called 𝐶𝐚, that's a place called ossuary, which they are now, of course, but and the movement of borders. And like, I've got a friend who writes and his whole ethos in writing his stories about Ireland is about borders, and about the unseen borders in Ireland, and the very real one at the our side of things. And it's very interesting about how his whole ethos is about the idea of borders. And I think it is very important in Irish history, because borders are fluctuating day on day, really. It might have been that mountaintop was the border one day, and then 2 days later it was that river 2 miles closer was the border. and people
Yeah.
were going from, you know, the protection of the McMurrough Kavanaghs to the McGilla Podrigs or whatever, you know, every other day. So there's so much to love about Irish history. I hope more people get involved in reading about Irish history and writing about Irish history, because my God, you could choose an age, choose the Tudors and write a Western based in the Tudor era. You know, go up to the 17th century
Yeah.
and get a Justin McCarthy with a big hat and long hair, riding around the Williamites. There's so much to love. I don't have enough time to write it, but somebody out there should.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you a question about something that happened a little bit more recently.
Ooh, okay.
Your family is Butler, and we've established their Anglo-Norman family. And I don't know if you caught the comments from our Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, recently, saying something like the Irish have never been a homogenous group. And he also said that the Vikings were more Irish than the Irish themselves. And I put out a video there the other day just saying like that's wrong, because it was never about the Vikings. It was about the Anglo-Norman families who became 𝐒𝐤𝐵𝐵𝐵 𝐂𝐚, which means more Irish than the Irish themselves. And I just felt compelled to put out this like a response video to that. And I wonder if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've been from Northern Ireland. It's sort of it would have passed me by had I not sort of seen that. I saw the thumbnail and I saw you kind of going, "Grr." But the I agree that the we're in a very interesting place here, because obviously uh, there was lots of kingdoms again. Sorry about this, kingdoms in Ireland at the time.
In groups.
Yeah, king groups, and they you know, obviously they fought each other as hard as they possibly could to get dominance, and you know that was there. But overarching the whole thing was a sense of oneness amongst those people who, you know, okay, maybe the way they spoke was slightly different as we are today. You know, our accents are different from one town to the next up here. Um, but there was oneness, and I think that's what he's trying to avoid saying over Ireland. And it's not. Listen, we live in a very different Ireland today, but there was a oneness of culture, of language, and like what else are we talking about if not those two things that make that a homogenous society?
Yeah.
If those two things aren't what make it, I don't know. You know, I presume there were different poets saying different stories, but sure, that's just stories. There were different people, singers singing different songs, but that's grand too. We love a different song. Um, but there was a oneness, and yes, into that came the Danes and the Norse, and but they were still being called Ost men in the 12th
Yeah.
century when the Normans arrived. They were still Ost men, so there was obviously a sense of otherness to them as well.
Yeah.
And
Well, we had at some point we had like the Hibernal Norse, which you could say, you know, they adopted Irish customs, or they had Irish parents, you know.
mm,
But I don't believe it was ever said that they were more Irish than the Irish themselves, except for the Normans, you know, the
yeah,
Anglo-Norman. That leads me on to the next question, which was going to be about statutes of Kilkenny, which I'm sure you're
oh yeah,
familiar with as well. They're the statutes that say, you know, are directed to the Anglo-Normans in Ireland, saying like, don't take Irish women for your nannies, don't wear your hair long like the Irish do. Uh, Use saddles on your horse. Don't ride the horses with no saddles like the Irish do. And the most important part was don't go to Brehons for the adjudication of your disputes. And like that, okay, that appealed to some Normans, but most of the Normans were like, this is actually better. And this is my point. That's what I was kind of saying in the video. It's like, well, why were they? What were they changing to?
yeah,
What were these people? Why were they adopting this culture if it wasn't already homogenous, if it wasn't already established, and if it wasn't already like ancient? You know?
yeah. And I completely agree with that point as well. And what is again, it's much easier. Like again, I'm from Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, whatever you want to call it. I'm Irish. I'm an Ulsterman, Northern Irish, British. You know, there's a whole heap of things that I could class myself as being. But I had a really good point, and I've just forgotten what I was making it of it. But the you know, I'm a complicated identity. I have a complicated identity. I can't believe that a person, 800 years before me had anything of that other than a complicated identity too. But obviously, a great deal of that was based in the fact that the Anglo-Irish and the Anglo-Normans and the Cambro-Normans were living here. They weren't, going off to England and then having a land. So the people who came later who had large lands over here were mostly living in England and had like agents and stuff overseeing their lands. These people were here all the time. They were living and interacting, sometimes violently, admittedly, but they were here and they were seeing firsthand the things that were going on. They could make a judgment on whether a certain type of law was better, or a certain type of way of expressing oneself in language was better. And if they're seeing, trying to communicate with somebody who, over in Clare or in Thomond, it would, they were going to do that in Irish. And I think even in, I was saying about Art McMurrough Kavanagh and Richard II, it's almost certain that the person who was acting as translator for Richard II in that interaction was James Butler, 3rd Earl of Ormond, because he was an Irish Earl who was sort of accepted as he was sort of considered Irish by the English and English by the Irish at that stage. It was that sort of idea of the middlemen. But he was an Earl, but his brothers, or his, the second sons were all far more likely to be culturally Irish than they were culturally English. The Earls and the guys who were the eldest sons probably held that kind of culture of England, pretty close, because they didn't want to lose the protection of the law, the English law. But the younger sons marrying Irish women generation after generation, their kids were probably no different to the Irish, but they still had, obeyed the authority of the Earl as well, because that's the chief of their nation, really. And it was the same in Desmond with the Earls of Desmond. They were, for the most part, culturally Irish. Now, eventually, like people it always slightly frustrates me, and this may be back to the old Butler Fitzgerald feud. I may still have it. It may still be in there. Worry, Dublin. Be worried. We may come back for a bit of another bite. But like the Kildare Fitzgeralds were always considered this kind of great Irish nationalist kind of superpower. Oh, we were never free, but if it wasn't for the Fitzgeralds, and it's kind of crap. They, the Earls of Kildare, if you look at the family tree, they married English, Anglo-Irish, English, Anglo-Irish the whole way down. It's the younger sons that are always going off and marrying Irish women and getting that Irish culture. Now, they're not immune to it, the Earls of Kildare, because they are still in Ireland, but they're always harking back to the across the water. It's the same in my family and the Butlers. They were all, Butlers are always kind of considered the most English. I think it's even today they're sort of considered the most English of the Anglo-Irish families. But they married into the chief of the Piers Rua Butler, my namesake. He married into his mum was a Kavanagh, his grandmother was an O'Carroll, his great grandmother was an O'Reilly. How can that not turn you into you can't do away with that. That's part of you. So it's terribly interesting. I agree that it must have felt like a wee bit of a letdown that the guy in charge of the country didn't really get it. But
yeah, and you know what? I mean, he might have a point, but now in recent years we have DNA evidence which supports the claim that most Irish people, if not all of the Irish people, have R1b haplogroup, which we can see that through genetics now, where I think some scholars are even revisiting things like the Leabhar Gabhála Éireann and saying like, maybe there's a bit of truth to this after all, So this is the last question. I reckon it's the last question anyway. What's coming up? Have you got any future projects?
Well, admittedly, we were saying about the last book came out in 2018. What I did just before that is I did a master's in English, and then straight after that got the book out, and then got a new job in TV. And I don't know, man, TV, it's a hard task. It looks like, you think it's all sort of champagne and parties and stuff. Oh my God, there has been some champagne parties, but it's a slog most of the time. So I keep on sort of tinkering with books. I've written 2 more, which are based in 1901, and it's kind of in the lead up to 1916. And I was always interested in the idea that all these poshos were kind of involved in 1916. It's always interested me that all these guys going, "Hello, Cahill Brewer here, how are you?" and being involved. And even Parnell and obviously, somebody like Erskine Childers was he'd have had he been in London, at a party, he wouldn't have looked out of place. And it's always interested me. So I thought I'd try and write a bit of a murder mystery based in that period in the lead up, and had a fairly posh person made up completely in the lead up to 1916 and how that would play out. I still have no idea how it'll play out, but it's an interesting one. So that's in. I've written a couple of murder mysteries based in that era, which is just great fun.
Okay.
And I've also been tinkering with the follow up to well, it's no great shakes, but the next Raymond de Carew book, which will be the Conquest of Dublin in 1170, which
Wow.
is the biggie.
Okay, and so if people want to get their hands on any copies of these books, Swordland, Lord of the Sea, and the Earl Strongbow, how can they do that?
Well, first and foremost, I hate to say it, but Amazon is always seems to be well stocked. It's through Headline Publishing, so Headline would love to jump in and take your money, because that's what publishers do. But Headline are a big company; they have all the books on ready to be bought. So if you want to go directly to them, that would be great. And I am usually terrible at Facebook and things like that, but if you want to get in touch with me, I am available on Twitter and Facebook. And I'm sure I can get books out to you if you fancied them. But they're a good read. They jump along, and if any TV producers want to come along and turn them into a HBO show, happy would I be.
Very good. Rua, thanks so much for your time and for sharing all of this very interesting information with us all.
Well, listen, thank you so much, Kevin.
Now, I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you did too. And I really learned a lot about what it must be like to be coming from an Anglo-Norman family. And Rua is a man who's really given a lot of thought to his roots, and I loved how open and fair and honest he was with his answers. And if you want to find his books, I'm going to include a link in the description and in the top pinned comment. So I'm sure he would be very grateful to receive your custom. Just one more time to remind you to please check out the brehonacademy.org. That's where you're going to find all the information about my online courses. We have a blog over there. We also have a members library. We have an online merchandise store. And if nothing takes your fancy over there, then please consider becoming a member of this YouTube channel for as little as $1.99 per month. That's going to give you exclusive access to all the videos that I put out. And in a later date, I'm going to run competitions. So have some very interesting things coming up. Help me reach 30,000 subscribers, please. So you've watched the whole video now, and if you're not subscribed to this channel, hopefully I've earned your subscription. Now, my friends, 𝐒𝐤𝐴, with all of that being said, thank you for watching, and slán go fóill.